Have you ever wondered how mixed martial arts went from an underground fight club to one of the biggest sports in the world? The UFC began in 1993 with three main founders: Rorion Gracie, who was a Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu grandmaster, Art David, a promoter that collabed with Gracie, and Bob Mayrotes, the head of an entertainment group that would broadcast the first event. Before MMA had begun to be seen as normal, it was always seen as taboo, and rightfully so, because in the early days of the UFC, these fights were really brutal due to the lack of rules like weight classes and no mandatory use of gloves. Also, the idea of people with different fighting styles, such as kickboxing, Muay Thai, and Taekwondo, had never been seen before. Even though these same reasons kept the UFC non-mainstream, it still had an audience like most niche things. A couple thousand people watching at first liked the awe factor and the almost unpolished feel the UFC brought. And after a while, this idea of people with different fighting styles began to catch on with entertaining fights. For example, in UFC 1, there was a fight with a 450-pound sumo wrestler and a 200-pound kickboxer that would end up winning by knockout. Fast forward to 2001. The UFC was still a struggling business, and it was bought for $2 million by casino executives Frank and Lorenzo Pereira, along with Dana White, a promoter. With their ownership, they brought stricter regulations, including weight classes, required gloves, and time limits. These new rules would end up bringing in new fans, and around the same time, the biggest fighters were Chuck Liddell, Tito Ortiz. But even with this new fan base and famous fighters, the UFC was still failing to make profit. And on 2004, the owners were debating on selling the company, until they began to pitch a reality TV show called The Ultimate Fighter, which basically was a show about MMA fighters that lived in a house and would compete against each other and train with each other for the chance at a six-figure contract with the UFC. And eventually, one person in the whole house would win. But UFC and the Dana White literally had to pay $10 million to the TV promoters because the UFC was still seen as too violent. And with the first episode pulling in 1.3 million views, the show would basically revive the UFC, introducing the MMA to a broader audience. This would also lead to more pay-per-view buys and attendees. This would segue into the golden era of the UFC, which was 2009 to 2014. This era of the UFC would birth some of the greatest fighters ever, such as Jon Jones, George St. Pierre, and Anderson Silva. Around this time, UFC 100 would sell 1.6 million pay-per-view buys, along with signing a new contract with Fox News. This would be the UFC's entrance into the mainstream. This part of the UFC's history matters so much because this would eventually lead to the UFC becoming a multi-billion-dollar organization with millions of fans. Fast forward to today's age of the UFC, which after the pandemic kind of went downhill. Although it didn't go downhill in popularity, it went down in quality, with a big problem plaguing the organization, and that problem is favoritism. It's always been a problem in the UFC, but after the previous owners sold the organization to the same owners of the WWE in 2023, it's always been more corporate than ever. And a lot of the people that watch the UFC like to complain that it doesn't have the same authenticity it used to have. Nowadays, it seems like they prioritize making as much money as they can. Going back to my main point, favoritism, they show this by protecting the most popular fighters and always going in their best interest. First, in matchmaking, famous fighters have a mediocre record, but popular, are always given a title shot early on in their career, while other fighters have to win at least 1,000 fights, a dozen fights, to be even considered for a title shot. In conclusion, although the organization and the sport is very flawed, it's still my favorite, and I feel as if it produces the best stars in the fighting